The rain drizzled lightly against the windshield as Monica Carter drove down the near-empty highway just outside Birmingham, Alabama. The glow of streetlights flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows over the slick pavement. It was late, just past 11, the kind of hour when the roads were mostly quiet, when people just wanted to get home. Monica tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, the low hum of a jazz classic filling the car. Her mind drifted between thoughts of the long day behind her and the warm bed waiting for her at home. Dressed in a simple black sweater and jeans, she looked like just another driver on the road, anonymous, unremarkable. At least, that's what she thought. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to RVM Black Struggles for more powerful narratives like this one. Then came the lights. Red and blue. Flashing. Gaining fast. A familiar pit settled in her stomach, not fear, but frustration. She had been in the military long enough to recognize when something felt off. There were no other cars nearby, no traffic violation she could recall. She checked her rearview mirror, taking in the white patrol car tailing her aggressively. Not again. She signaled, slowly changing lanes before easing onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, exhaled deliberately, and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. Protocol. She knew how this went. If you think Monica's doing the right thing by staying calm and following protocol, comment 1 below. If you think she should have challenged the stop immediately, comment 0. And if you're still thinking about it, hit that subscribe button to stay engaged. The patrol car idled behind her for a long moment, its headlights cutting through the misty darkness. The delay wasn't accidental. She'd seen it before, a psychological game. A power play. Finally, the driver's side door swung open. The officer stepped out slowly, moving like a man who expected absolute obedience. Heavy boots scuffed against wet asphalt. One hand rested on his belt, the other gripped a flashlight that flickered on as he approached. Monica turned her head slightly, watching him through the side mirror. Sergeant Jake Miller. The name on his badge gleamed under the dim glow of his flashlight. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just pure authority. Monica met his eyes in the mirror, her expression unreadable. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she reached for her glove compartment, retrieving the documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" Her voice was steady. Controlled. "This is where things take a turn. Want to know what happens next? Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of the story. Justice matters, and so does staying informed." Miller didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a once-over. Taillights out. Monica frowned. That couldn't be right. She had checked her lights just a few days ago. Miller finally met her gaze. "Are you arguing with me?" A slow beat of silence passed. Monica could feel the shift in the air, that quiet, unspoken moment where power met resistance, where one side expected the other to fold. But Monica Carter wasn't someone who folded. She had faced war zones, had given orders on naval ships and high-stakes operations. She had looked danger in the eye and never blinked. And she wasn't about to start now. Monica knew better than to argue, but she also knew her rights. Keeping her hands visible, she took a slow breath. "I'm just saying," she replied, voice even. "I had my taillights checked recently, but if there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." Miller tilted his head slightly, his smirk barely visible in the dim glow of his flashlight. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone shifting from passive authority to cold command. Her pulse picked up. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, still calm. Miller took a step closer, lowering the flashlight slightly so she could see the smirk fade from his face. "Because I said so." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Monica clenched her jaw, glancing toward the dark road ahead. There were no witnesses, no passing cars to see this unfold. Her military training screamed at her, "This is a setup." She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. Every movement was measured, deliberate. No sudden motions. She unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected as she stepped onto the pavement. She stood tall, keeping her hands at her sides, posture relaxed but alert. Miller took a step back, scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Turn around." Hands on the car. This time, she hesitated. "For what reason?" Miller's smirk vanished completely. "Are you resisting?" His tone had changed. Less smug, more forceful. He was baiting her, pushing her into a confrontation. Monica met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "No," she said firmly. "I'm asking a question." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, maybe even amusement. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Without warning, Miller reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker. Then, louder. "Turn around." Monica's heartbeat remained steady. If she pushed back too hard, she knew where this would go. But if she complied, she could fight this later, where it mattered. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The cool metal pressed against her palms. Miller wasted no time. The handcuffs snapped around her wrists, far too tight. He yanked her arms behind her back and shoved her toward the patrol car. "You have no idea what you're doing," she murmured, keeping her voice steady. Miller chuckled darkly. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into Monica's back as she sat still, wrists burning from the too tight cuffs. Her breathing remained measured, but inside, she was calculating. Sergeant Jake Miller strutted back to his car like he had just won a prize, muttering something into his radio. His movements were deliberate, he was enjoying this. Monica glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat. The faint reflection of her face stared back, calm, composed. But beneath that, something simmered. This wasn't fear. This was focus. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed. Then 5. Then 10. Her fingers twitched slightly, testing the cuffs. Still too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open, and Miller slid in, whistling to himself. Well, he muttered, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's take a little ride." Monica said nothing. Miller threw the car into gear, jerking it back onto the highway. The overhead lights still flashed, painting streaks of red and blue across the dark road. "You know," he said after a moment, glancing at her through the rearview mirror, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Monica exhaled slowly through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Miller laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his gaze through the mirror. "I don't think," she said flatly. "I know." For the first time, he hesitated. Just a flicker of uncertainty. His fingers flexed around the wheel. But then he covered it up with another smirk. "You military?" His tone shifted, suddenly probing. Monica didn't answer. "Yeah, I figured," he continued, his voice casual. "You got that attitude. That above-the-law type." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" She still didn't respond. Miller clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Shame," he mused. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Monica's jaw tightened. The audacity. As if his actions were somehow her fault. Up ahead, the police station loomed, a squat gray brick building just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty. Miller pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, "I do love when they make it easy." Before Monica could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go." Monica twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out, the metal biting into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside. Past a bored-looking desk sergeant. Past the buzzing overhead lights. Straight into the heart of the system that had let men like Miller thrive. But what Miller didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his luck had just run out. The stale smell of coffee and sweat hung heavy in the air as Monica was marched through the dimly lit precinct. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, adding to the dreary, oppressive atmosphere of the place. Sergeant Jake Miller's grip on her arm was unnecessarily firm, his fingers digging into her wrist like he needed to remind her he was in control. He wasn't. The moment Monica had stepped through those doors, she had already begun working out exactly how this would play out. As Miller led her toward the processing desk, she took in her surroundings. The officers behind the counter barely looked up. Just another night, just another arrest. This was routine for them. How many times had men like Miller done this before? How many people had been walked through these doors with no one to fight for them? She clenched her jaw. That wasn't going to be her story. "Hello," disinterested voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Name?" The desk sergeant didn't even glance at her as he shuffled through paperwork. Miller answered for her. "Monica Carter." The sergeant finally looked up. His gaze flickered briefly with recognition at her name, something shifted in his expression, but just as quickly, it was gone. He continued writing. Monica smirked inwardly. Yeah. You know who I am. The next few minutes were a humiliating blur of fingerprints, mugshots, and official forms, all carried out with the same robotic detachment. Miller stayed close, arms crossed, watching her every move with a smug expression. He was enjoying this too much. She knew his type. He wasn't just a bad cop, he was a dangerous one. As soon as they finished processing, Miller grabbed her wrist again, guiding her toward the holding cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath as they walked down the hallway. Monica turned her head slightly, her voice cool. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. That got under his skin. Miller yanked open the heavy steel door, shoving her forward. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered as the bars slid shut between them. Monica caught herself before she stumbled. Slowly, she turned to face him. Miller smirked, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. She exhaled slowly and sank onto the cold metal bench inside the cell. One night. That was all it would take. Because Miller had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But Monica wasn't the only one who knew it. Back at the front desk, a younger officer hesitated as he stared at the processing papers. He bit his lip, debating whether to speak up. Something about this didn't sit right. Then, as if on cue, the phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and froze. The number on the screen belonged to someone way above his pay grade. Something told him, this night wasn't over yet. Monica sat still on the cold metal bench, her wrists aching from the two tight cuffs that had only been removed minutes ago. The cell smelled of old sweat and disinfectant, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. She had spent the last hour listening, tuning into the faint murmur of voices outside, catching snippets of conversation between officers at the front desk. She wasn't the only one who knew this arrest was wrong. And now, someone had finally decided to do something about it. Meanwhile, at the front desk, a young officer, Deputy Eric Lawson, held the ringing phone to his ear, his face tight with unease. Yes, sir. She's here. She was brought in about an hour ago." He listened for a moment before his eyes widened. He turned his back slightly, lowering his voice. "Yes, sir." "By Sergeant Miller." "No, sir, I don't believe there was a warrant." There was a pause, then a sharp command on the other end of the line. Lawson swallowed hard, darting a glance toward the hallway where Miller had disappeared after locking Monica up. "Yes, sir. I understand." Right away. The call ended. For a moment, Lawson hesitated, gripping the receiver tightly. He knew what this meant. Someone high up had just found out. And when that happened, it was never good news for the arresting officer. Taking a deep breath, he turned and hurried down the hallway. Back in the holding cell, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, the same arrogant, measured stride Monica had come to recognize. Miller. She didn't move as he appeared in front of the cell, arms crossed, that same smug smirk playing on his lips. "Comfy?" he asked, tilting his head. She met his gaze, calm. "You know," he continued, stepping closer to the bars, lowering his voice, "if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." Monica let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." The smirk faltered, just for a second. A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance. Uncertainty. He covered it fast, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he muttered, shrugging. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." Monica didn't flinch. Didn't react. She just watched him. Because he had no idea what was coming. And then, it happened. A voice from down the hall. "Sergeant Miller." Miller turned, irritated by the interruption. Deputy Lawson stood there, clipboard in hand, looking unusually stiff. "We got a call," Lawson said, his voice carrying a trace of hesitation. "You need to come to the front desk. Now." Miller frowned. "Who is it?" Lawson glanced at Monica before answering. "Legal counsel. And someone from higher up." A tense beat passed. Monica saw it, the flicker of doubt that flashed across Miller's face. He turned back toward her, searching her expression for some hint of an answer. She simply tilted her head slightly. "Looks like someone is coming for me after all," she murmured. Miller's jaw tightened. Without another word, he turned and stormed down the hall, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete. At the front desk, the room was eerily quiet as Captain Frank Bennett, the head of internal affairs, stood with his arms crossed, his presence alone enough to make every officer within earshot straighten up. Beside him stood Carla Whitman, Monica's attorney, flipping through a folder of documents with the efficiency of someone who had already won. Captain Bennett's gaze was locked on Miller as the sergeant approached, his expression unreadable. Miller tried to maintain his composure, but something was off. The air felt heavier. "What's going on?" Miller demanded, his voice just slightly less confident than before. Captain Bennett didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the folder in Carla's hands, flipping to the first page. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Sergeant Miller, would you care to explain why you arrested Lieutenant Commander Monica Carter under false pretenses?" Miller felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Bennett finally looked up. His next words were like a bullet to the chest. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." For the first time that night, Sergeant Jake Miller felt something close to fear. He had walked into the precinct fully in control. But now, as Captain Frank Bennett's words settled into the air like a hammer striking an anvil, the power dynamic had shifted. Miller swallowed, straightening his posture. "I was following protocol," he said, forcing his voice to stay level. Bennett didn't blink. "Protocol?" he echoed, flipping through the file. "Because according to body cam footage, there was no probable cause for Lieutenant Commander Carter's arrest." Miller stiffened. Body cam footage. He had forgotten about that. Captain Bennett turned to Carla Whitman, Monica's attorney. "Ms. Whitman," Bennett said, handing her a folder, "would you care to explain to Sergeant Miller why he's in deep trouble?" Whitman barely glanced up from the paperwork, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Certainly," she said. "Sergeant Miller," she met his gaze, "your body cam recorded every second of your little power trip. Your intimidation tactics. Your fabricated charge. And most importantly, your excessive force in the arrest of a decorated military officer with a spotless record." Miller clenched his jaw. Whitman continued, "That means not only was this an illegal arrest, but under Alabama state law, you falsified a police report, which is a felony offense. And since your little traffic stop was based on what appears to be racial profiling, the Department of Justice has been notified as well." A cold sweat broke out along the back of Miller's neck. This was worse than he expected. Bennett leaned forward, voice low and firm. "You violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and abused your power. And I'm willing to bet, once we dig into your past stops, we'll find this wasn't the first time." A sharp murmur rippled through the precinct. Several officers nearby exchanged glances. This was serious. Miller felt his confidence slipping. He had always gotten away with things before. A few fabricated charges here and there, a little excessive force when someone talked back. Who was going to stop him? But this time, he had picked the wrong woman. He had picked Monica Carter. Bennett turned to Deputy Eric Lawson, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Deputy, pull Sergeant Miller's 5-year arrest history and flag any stops involving minority drivers," Bennett ordered. Miller's stomach dropped. Lawson hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Whitman crossed her arms, smirking slightly. "Hope you have a good lawyer, Sergeant." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Monica Carter sat calmly, hands clasped, waiting. She knew what was happening outside. She had seen it before, the way corrupt men unraveled the moment the system turned on them. The first cracks in their arrogance. The way their power slipped through their fingers like sand. The cell door creaked open. A different officer, one she hadn't seen before, stood there, looking sheepish. Lieutenant Commander Carter?" He cleared his throat, unable to meet her eyes. "You're free to go." Monica didn't move immediately. She took her time, standing up slowly, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the last few hours. As she stepped out, she turned to the young officer. "Who made the call?" she asked. The officer hesitated. "Someone high up," he said. "All I know is, it wasn't just one call." Monica's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. No, it wouldn't have been just one. Because Miller had made the mistake of thinking she was alone. He didn't realize that when you target the wrong person, the world watches. And now, he was the one being hunted. Back at the precinct, Miller sat in stunned silence as Captain Bennett handed him a single sheet of paper. His suspension notice. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending an internal affairs investigation." The words felt like a bullet to the chest. "Turn in your badge and gun," Bennett added, voice final. Miller's hand twitched toward his belt. He had walked into the precinct a king. Now, he was leaving as a cautionary tale. His world had just imploded, and it was far from over. Sergeant Jake Miller sat at his desk, staring blankly at the suspension notice in his hands. His badge, once a symbol of absolute control, now lay cold and meaningless on the table in front of him. Everything had unraveled so fast. Monica Carter was supposed to be just another arrest, another name in a long list of people who had learned the hard way not to challenge him. But this time, something had gone wrong. This time, the system hadn't protected him. And that terrified him. But Miller wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Meanwhile, across town, Monica Carter sat in a small, quiet law office, a steaming cup of coffee untouched beside her. Across from her, Carla Whitman, her attorney, flipped through a thick stack of papers with methodical precision. "The good news?" Carla said, barely glancing up. "Miller's been suspended indefinitely. The DA's office is already reviewing his arrest history, and the DOJ is involved now. It's only a matter of time before he's formally charged." Monica leaned back in her chair, watching Carla closely. "And the bad news?" she asked. Carla finally looked up, tapping a pen against the folder. "Someone leaked your personal records to the media." A beat of silence. Monica's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "Excuse me?" Carla sighed, pushing a manila envelope across the table. "Anonymous sources," she muttered. "Your military service file, past assignments, even a few confidential reports you worked on. It's already spreading online. The headlines are painting you as, well, let's just say, an aggressive officer with a history of overstepping boundaries." Monica's eyes darkened. This wasn't a mistake. This was retaliation. Miller, or someone connected to him, was trying to discredit her. If they couldn't erase her, they'd try to make her the villain. Her jaw tightened. "I should have expected this." Carla leaned forward. "That's not all." Monica raised an eyebrow. "They're digging into your family, too." A cold wave passed through her. Her father. Her younger brother. She had kept them out of the spotlight for a reason. And now, because of one power-hungry cop who had been backed into a corner, they were being dragged into the fire. At the precinct, Miller paced inside a dimly lit back office, his phone pressed against his ear. "This is getting out of control," he hissed into the receiver. A gruff voice responded on the other end, calm but firm. "You got sloppy." Miller's grip on the phone tightened. "I didn't think she'd have that kind of backing," he admitted, lowering his voice. "Now internal affairs is all over me, and the DOJ." "Then fix it," the voice interrupted. "Before this goes higher." Miller exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "You don't think I'm trying?" he snapped. "They already suspended me. I need more time." "You don't have time," the voice countered. "She's not the problem anymore. The people backing her are. If this keeps blowing up, it won't just be your badge on the line." Miller stopped pacing. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. There were others, people higher up, who had their own secrets to protect. And Monica Carter was about to drag them all into the light. Later that night, Monica pulled into the driveway of her townhouse, the events of the day weighing on her shoulders. She had faced worse before, but this was different. She had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. As she stepped out of her car, the crisp night air sent a chill down her spine. Something felt off. She glanced around. The quiet suburban street was just as it had always been, empty, peaceful. But her instincts, honed from years in the military, screamed danger. Then she saw it. A car, parked just down the street. No lights on, engine barely humming. Watching. Her heart pounded. They weren't just trying to discredit her. They were watching her now. And this fight had just taken a turn she never saw coming. The realization hit Monica like a cold wave. She wasn't just dealing with one corrupt cop anymore. This was bigger. This was organized. Her military instincts kicked in as she casually reached into her bag, pretending to fumble for her keys. But her mind was racing. The car parked down the street, no movement, no interior lights. Someone was watching her. Waiting. She knew she had two choices. Walk inside like nothing was wrong and hope whoever was in that car wasn't planning to escalate things tonight. Call it out. Make it clear she knew. Monica chose option 2. She turned on her heel and walked straight toward the car. The moment she took 2 steps forward, the engine roared to life. The headlights flashed on, nearly blinding her for a split second. And just like that, the car sped off into the night. Monica didn't move. She just watched, heart pounding but face unreadable. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, the system strikes back. Monica walked into Carla Whitman's office just after sunrise, dropping a stack of printed articles onto her desk. Lieutenant Commander Monica Carter, a troubled past? Military officer known for questionable tactics now accusing heroic police sergeant of misconduct. Was this an arrest? Or an act of defiance? Carla skimmed through the headlines, sighing. "They're going all in," she muttered. "Trying to paint you as an aggressive soldier with an attitude problem." Monica folded her arms. "It won't work." Carla looked up. "They don't need it to work, Monica. They just need doubt." Enough for a jury to hesitate. Enough for people to start second-guessing whether you really were non-compliant. Monica clenched her jaw. They don't want this to be about Miller anymore, Carla continued. They want this to be about you. Monica inhaled slowly. Then let's remind them what this is really about. The courtroom, the final blow. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The media had swarmed outside, eager for the headline moment of this case. On one side, Monica sat, poised and unreadable, with Carla by her side. On the other, Jake Miller. Except now, Miller no longer had the confidence he once did. His suspension had turned into termination. Internal affairs had dug into his past, and what they found wasn't pretty. 37 complaints. 9 cases of excessive force. 2 ongoing lawsuits. And, of course, Monica's case. But the real nail in the coffin? The body cam footage. Played in its entirety for everyone to see. The smug tone in Miller's voice as he fabricated the excuse. The unnecessary force when he twisted her arms behind her back. The arrogance, the intimidation, the abuse of power. By the time the footage ended, the courtroom was silent. Even Miller knew. It was over. The verdict, a shift in power. The judge looked down at Miller, eyes unreadable. Sergeant Miller, your conduct was not only a violation of protocol, it was a violation of public trust. Miller's hands clenched into fists. The judge continued. As of today, all charges against Lieutenant Commander Carter are dismissed. Furthermore, I strongly recommend that the Department of Justice proceed with its investigation into your actions. Then came the final blow. And I suggest you find yourself a good defense attorney. Because I have a feeling you're going to need one. Outside the courthouse, a war won. But not the war itself. Monica stepped outside, greeted by a wave of reporters. Lieutenant Commander Carter. Do you feel justice was served today? She turned, expression calm but firm. This wasn't about me, she said simply. This was about a system that allows men like Jake Miller to believe they're untouchable. A flurry of cameras flashed. She glanced at Carla before adding. And this is only the beginning. The aftermath, a price for the truth. Later that night, Monica sat in a quiet cafe, stirring her coffee as her phone buzzed. Carla, Miller's officially under federal investigation. Word is, more officers from his department are being looked at too. Monica exhaled slowly. Good. She looked out the window, watching the city move on around her. This wasn't the first time someone had abused power. And it wouldn't be the last. But this time, someone fought back. And won. A mother and son walked past the window, the boy laughing, carefree. Monica watched them for a moment. Because this fight? It had never been just for her. 4-0. Lessons from the story, standing up against injustice. Monica Carter's story isn't just fiction, it reflects a very real issue in today's society. Abuse of power, racial profiling, and the fear that speaking up could cost you everything are problems that many people still face. But her story teaches us an important lesson: silence allows corruption to thrive, while courage forces change. One of the biggest takeaways from this case is the power of evidence and accountability. If Monica hadn't stayed calm, asserted her rights, and had the support of people who believed in justice, her story could have ended very differently. This is why we must record, report, and hold those in power accountable. Another lesson? The fight doesn't end with one victory. Corrupt systems don't crumble overnight. One bad officer being removed doesn't fix the deeper issues that allow abuse to exist in the first place. That's why it's crucial to stay engaged, speak up, and demand reform, whether that's through voting, activism, or simply refusing to accept injustice as just the way things are. Your voice matters. Change starts when people refuse to be intimidated, when they challenge wrongdoing, and when they stand together for what's right. Because real justice isn't just about one case, it's about creating a system where no one has to fear for their rights again.